speech shall I give? The optimistic one or the pessimistic?
Is there any writing pad? I need a writing pad. No, pad.
Okay, Wes.
Yes, sure.
Well, where Paul's gone.
He's going to get a pen and pad. We'll start with the pad. Спасибо.
Straight to this. You got it.
Hello. Paul Goldstein.
That's what our subject, world disorder. And I wrote about world disorder. Yes, can dialogue between cultures and civilizations overcome the current impasse? That's the question. I've answered that question.
Ladies and gentlemen, let's make a start. We are running somewhat behind the schedule, but we have an hour for this panel on global order and European security. A very warm welcome to all of you. Thanks for being here, and I will introduce the panelists in just a minute. Let me say very briefly what this panel is about. We've discussed over the last day and a half or so the role of culture and civilization in international politics. And there's, of course, still an ongoing debate about whether geopolitics is fundamentally about the economy or security or technology, or whether it is about cultural and civilizational values and norms. Yesterday, there was a panel on the civilizational state, and one of our panelists, Christopher Coker, argued in a book entitled The Rise of the Civilizational State that we are now at a point, and I quote him, if not verbatim, where civilization is the new currency of international politics. This panel will not revisit that debate. What it will do is to ask the question of European and global order and disorder, and how culture and civilization may offer some resource to perhaps chart a way out of the impasse in which we find ourselves. An impasse which is not only economic or about security or technology, but it is also about identity. The identity of Europe in the world, but also the identity of the various European powers, both in Europe and globally. And of course, Europe has always been a crucible of civilizations. There is no such thing as the starting point of Europe. Europe is the confluence of civilizations that started as far as India, but also, of course, ancient Greece, the Middle East, and Africa as well. And in today's world, Europe is not at the same level as the United States or China or Russia or India. It's not a state with a government in quite the same way at all. And yet, the question of Europe is not going away. Perhaps the shift from the Euro-Atlantic to the Eurasian and Indo-Pacific world is ongoing, but Europe is, and I think will continue to be, a flashpoint of international politics. Whether it's events in Ukraine or in the Balkans, or indeed new conflicts that might arise in contact with Turkey or other places, Europe is certainly not disappearing from the map of geopolitics. So this panel will be asking questions about how the European powers can perhaps use some common cultural, social and civilizational ties to find a way out of the impasse we're in. This is organized together with the University of Kent and LSE Ideas, and I will hand the floor to the first speaker, Professor Michael Cox, who's director of LSE Ideas. He will be followed by the Russian permanent representative to the European Union, Vladimir Chizhov, who's on my immediate right. After the ambassador, we will have a presentation from Dr. Aaron McKeel, also of LSE Ideas. He will be followed by Dr. Yelena Shebankova, who is the author of Political Ideologies in Contemporary Russia. She will be followed by Professor Richard Sacre from the University of Kent. And the final speaker will be Professor Coker, also of LSE Ideas. And we will then have some comments from our discussant, Paul Goldstein. So, Mick, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Adrian, and thanks to all the other panelists. One of the themes of this conference, inspired in part, I think, by my colleague from the LSE, Christopher Coker, has been the notion of a civilizational state. It's a concept which I both find suggestive, original, challenging, and one that can be challenged in many, many ways. But still, it has generated, I think, a great debate, and I think we should thank all those who've brought that concept to the fore into a wider discussion about international relations. One of the things which I think has been slightly absent here at the conference, and it means no criticism, but I'll make my point, is that in some ways, if you're looking at civilizational states, one could actually make the case that one of the most successful civilizational states in history has been the United States of America. I mean, many others at this conference I notice have been claimed to be civilizational states, India, China, many, many others, but the word civilizational state, it may be in your book, Christopher, but it hasn't been much discussed here, has to be taken into consideration. After all, it was a civilization which was originally from Europe, but not Europe. It defined itself from Europe, but it wasn't Europe. It was not Europe in a sense. It was a civilization as opportunity. It was a civilization as a notion of a city on a hill. It was a civilization as a beacon to others. The Statue of Liberty, after all, is a rather symbolic piece of architecture standing in New York Harbor. Whether Trump has read the words underneath is another question. It was a civilization insofar as a civilization should be a model for others to follow. And in that regard, historically, certainly through the 20th century, Henry Luce used the term an American century back in 1941. It'd be very difficult, whatever you think of America and American foreign policy, not to think of it, at least until the last few years, as being a model which others did follow. And in a way, it's a civilizational state in the terms that I understand it. It's a kind of liberal empire. It doesn't do empire in the traditional sense, but it's a kind of liberal empire, and has been rather successful at doing so. And part of that project, of course, has been associated with the association of its own prosperity with that of the global economy, globalization. So there's much, I think, that could be argued that if we're looking at a successful, continuing, 250-year civilizational state, then maybe we should be talking much more about the United States. The question is whether it's still performing the roles that it is performing today or has performed in the past. And this, of course, brings me then to Trump. There's two words that have been used here, and whenever one uses them, people start smiling or crying. One is Brexit, and the other one is Trump. I think the two are connected, by the way. Let me say that straight away. I think Brexit gave enormous inspiration to Trump, that it could be done. I think until then maybe he thought it wouldn't be done, but I think there is a major connection there. But I just want to say a few things quickly, because I know we've only got a few minutes, Adrian, about the United States, and then bring it back to the question of Europe very quickly. I say three things about the United States, and in the context of that, also about Trump. One, there's been much talk here about American decline. Whether it's relative or absolute, or whether it's a loss of soft power, etc., etc., etc. We are moving into a post-American world. We are moving into a multipolar world. Unipolarity is no longer the name of the game. The American century will not be 21st, it'll be an Asian century. Now, I buy into some part of the argument about the relative decline of the United States, but I think we've got to be extraordinarily cautious in terms of assuming that somehow or another America will repeat what the British Empire did, or what every other great empire has done in history. To that degree, I think first thing I'd say is don't overestimate its decline. Beware of that kind of declinist simplification, which draws from history and therefore thinks the future will look like other people's past. There may be something fundamentally exceptional about the United States, which I think we need to take on board. And if others do overestimate the decline of the United States, I think this is also a source of deep disorder and problems. The second thing I'd like to say briefly, just by way of provocation, is don't underestimate Trump. I would say, actually, if one goes back really before 2015, before his own election, 16, 17, everybody said he wouldn't win, and he won. Everybody said that he could never be elected, and he was elected. Okay, he was elected in a system which didn't win the majority, but he still won, and he won in the American system. And I think there's been a great propensity by most academics, and I might say liberal academics as well, because they don't like Trump, they've underestimated him. And therefore, I think, again, if we're looking long-term, at the role of the United States in the world, don't think that this is simply a blip. And that brings me to my third point. Many people assume that Trump is a blip, that this is simply a 4-year, whatever you want to call it, wonder or not a wonder, the opposite. I'm not so certain about that. I'm absolutely not so certain about that. I think we may be moving into a new era of international politics in a way, and I see him as part of a general phenomenon, which of course does go back to Brexit. This is why I give Brexit and the year 2016 world historical significance. I think 2016 will be seen as being as important possibly as 1989, 2001 and 2008 in terms of reshaping, realigning and redefining. Because when two of the leading globalizing powers in the world go in an entirely different direction to the one that they have been traveling in before, then that is going to shape the rest of the global economy. And I think much of the talk about the crisis of the liberal economy goes back to that. It's part of a general phenomenon, and it's not just Anglo-American. It's part of what we call the backlash against populism. Now, what does that mean, to come to the point, really, about Europe and world disorder and European insecurity? I think we are in a new era, and therefore the impact on Europe, I think, is going to be huge over the long term. I think this is leading to a major realignment within Europe. It's already beginning to lead to a major realignment in Europe. Europe is now thinking things it never thought before. More importantly, it's doing things it never did before in terms of European armies and talking seriously. Whether it's going to translate that into reality, I don't know. And I think it's also part and parcel of something which has also been discussed at this conference, of decoupling. I think there is a kind of decoupling which is taking place between the United States and the European Union. Obviously, the economic relations remain still there. NATO will not die away. But I think there has been what I would call a kind of psychological, existential decoupling. It's a transatlantic drift, and I'll end on this point. For years and years and years, experts like myself and Christopher, no doubt, have been talking about a crisis in the transatlantic relationship. We did it with Reagan, that turned out to be wrong. We did it again with George W. Bush. I even wrote a book called The Death of the West, got that wrong yet again. Another academic, mea culpa, mea maxima culpa. We sometimes get it wrong, you know. But I think now this is it. You know, the boy who cried wolf once, twice and thrice. This may actually be the moment of a deeper disorder within the transatlantic relationship, and its consequences for European insecurity or security and for world order are going to be profound.
Thank you very much, Mick. Very striking thoughts, and the one I thought was particularly interesting is this idea that the future will not necessarily look like other people's past, so that we cannot be certain the US, if it is in decline, will decline in the way that Britain did or other empires before it. Thank you so much. Ambassador, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. First of all, First of all, I believe it was a great idea by the organizers to put this table in triangle. The triangle being, you know, the most stable of all geometrical figures. Anyway, I think the organizers were also quite right to define that sources of modern instability originate mainly in Europe. Probably the Euro-Atlantic, to be more precise, and thereby are closely linked with the crisis of the pan-European system of values. I'll be talking more about Europe rather than the United States, the EU being my collective client. European Commission President Jean-Claude Juncker, whose bright tenure is coming to an end, not so long ago described the situation in the EU as a polycrisis, a Greek word to begin with, and rightly so. We witness the still ongoing crisis of the euro that has merely overcome an acute stage, a migration volcano erupting its lava of rage every now and then, stagnation of living standards, virtually eroding the middle class, the main social pillar of the European Union, as well as a painfully protracted Brexit procedure. I would add to this list a crisis of the basic EU values that the EU is not only proud of, but also trying to spread far beyond its territory. In less than 3 weeks from now, a new European Commission, defined by its President-elect Ursula von der Leyen as geopolitical, will assume office, or at least is expected to. We will see how geopolitics exercised by incoming European commissioners will facilitate addressing the crisis phenomena I enumerated and preserving Europe's global economic and political profiles in the changing multipolar world. I am far from giving advice to the new EU leadership, but I would like to point out the obvious. The only way to prevent the European Union from turning into a ramshackle backyard of the world's economy and politics already in this century is to unite Europe, and rather Eurasia from Lisbon to Vladivostok. It is certainly a difficult task, and its implementation will require a lot of effort from the countries involved. But as the Chinese philosopher Lao Tzu noted already in 6th century BC, that was even before the Parthenon was built, a journey of 1,000 miles starts with the first step. Among such first steps may be to stop calling the EU a continent. For instance, when heads of European institutions state their goal of making the EU the world's first carbon-neutral continent, or stop piling up artificial barriers, arbitrarily named sanctions and other restrictions, or stop substituting the clear and comprehensible international law based on the UN Charter with the so-called rules-based international order. Otherwise, the artificial, in my view, antagonism between patriotism and globalism imposed from outside will inevitably drive Europe along the wrong path. The same Europe deridingly described by supporters of the concept of a melting pot for cultures and civilizations as a salad bowl, perhaps, but one that really enables different countries, nations and cultures closely interacting with each other, also to preserve their national traits. As far as more general recipe for uniting Eurasia is concerned, I believe that a simple phrase is enough to describe it: integrating integrations. That is, conjugating economic potentials of the two largest integration projects on our continent, the real continent, the Eurasian Economic Union and the European Union. It is worth noting that this recipe was first formulated yet at the Moscow Russia-EU Summit of 2005 in a roadmap on the common space of external security. In my view, it is hardly questionable that a greater Eurasia, only combining investment and technological capacities of the EU with the resource base of Russia and its Eurasian Economic Union partners, can provide healthy competition to the rapidly developing Asia-Pacific region. Besides clear economic benefits, opting for integrating integrations would allow to support the emblematic EU principle of multilateralism. I would emphasize that talking about healthy competition, we are by no means opposing the Eurasian mega project to initiatives originating in the Asia-Pacific region, including those in the People's Republic of China. We proceed from the understanding that the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative fully matches our view of a common economic and humanitarian space throughout Eurasia. It is obvious that to ensure security in our common European home, we cannot do without each other. I think EU member states also understand it well. But stubbornness and maybe some protracted bias do not allow certain European capitals to acknowledge it aloud. At the same time, for instance, at the conference of French ambassadors last August, President Macron put it straight that the time of Western hegemony in the world was coming to an end, and it was time to thoroughly rethink relations with Moscow, without which a new security architecture in Europe could not be built. The Russian side is ready to start substantive talks on the parameters of a reliable and just system of equal and indivisible security in Euro-Atlantic and Eurasia. Our proposals are on the table. It is also clear that we need a permanent dialogue channel at the highest level if possible to discuss multiple issues we're facing. Change at the top, at the EU top, seems to give us an opportunity to disrupt a pause in Russia-EU relations that has been too protracted, as Brussels acknowledges. It goes without saying that resuming our communication would be more beneficial if the EU defined its own development model and its way to address the challenges it faces in more specific terms. At the same time, I believe it would be careless not to take into consideration the realities of the objective course of history, as mechanically going back to doing business as usual is hardly possible any longer. The world presents surging demand for a fairer and more inclusive system, and multiple models of development prevent us from saying that the Western set of liberal values has no alternative. It would certainly be hardly possible to impose these values by force with no attention paid to the history of states, their cultural and political codes. So to conclude, it's time to talk, to hear each other and listen to each other. Russia is ready for that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Crisis of EU values, the need to build a common security architecture, and dialogue at the highest level. That's some of the things that including at the highest level, absolutely. And one where we both listen and learn. Thank you very much. Aaron.
Right, thank you. Is this working? Yes. To our conversation about civilization, I would like to attempt to contribute some thoughts on global disorder and the concept of disorder. What do we mean by disorder? It's in the title of our talk at our conference, and help to relate that to our discussion of civilization. What do we mean by global disorder? I think we mean three different things. We often use the language of global disorder to mean a condition of instability that precipitates war, indeed great power war. I don't think the rise of civilizational states or civilizational discourse induces or reduces the chances of war or great power war. Power shift and miscalculation are enough. When we talk about disorder, we also talk about disorder in the sense of irresponsible foreign policy. We talk about disorder in the sense of breaking treaties, illegal wars. This is another sense in which we use the language. We've seen a lot of this lately in international affairs. I don't think civilizational states or civilization has much to do with that. I think that's more a fallout of economic disorder and just bad statesmanship, bad leadership. The third sense of disorder, I think, is the most interesting. I think we should focus on this one in our conversation. The third way in which we talk about disorder is the gap between our ambitions of order and the order we have, the order we want and the reality of our order's underperformance. We often talk about the old institutions of our 1945 order, the need to update our institutions. This is a way in which we talk about global disorder. And I think the discussion of civilization is quite helpful when we talk about that sense of disorder. When we talk about civilizations, we can help clarify what type of ambitions we do have, whether they're overlapping or whether they're in conflict, and what kind of order we actually want. I think, indeed, we should talk more about not only multiple civilizational ambitions, European or otherwise, but global common ambitions. If we're attempting to discuss a global order as a common global project, we might indeed think about a global civilization. By this concept, I don't mean the homogenization of cultures or uniformity of humankind. I mean rather the kind of Venn diagram of our ambitions and values. I suspect there are places of overlap, and clarifying what those are through the discourse of civilization might be helpful. So if we want to talk about global order and disorder and reorder in civilization, I think we should talk about disorder in the third sense, and not only about multiple civilizations, but at least to explore the idea of global civilization. Thank you. Thank you.
Aaron, thank you so much. That was fascinating and also extremely concise. talking about different types of disorder, and certainly this idea of an overlap of culture and civilization that might even give some meaning to the term global civilization. Thank you very much. Elena.
Thank you. Does this? Yes, it works. Well, I find two themes most important within the framework of our discussion. The first theme pertains to the mode of the dialogue between civilizations, and the second theme concerns the question whether this dialogue is possible at all. With respect to the mode of a dialogue, 2 points are of essence. First, we could depart from searching for consensus or from defining our differences. Searching for consensus as an initial step of a dialogue is, in my view, quite treacherous. In its extreme, this approach means that one party gives its epistemic or ideological foundation to another and submerges the opponent to the opposite existential paradigm. Defining the differences between the existing parties without submerging one culture to another is a more productive way forward, in my view. French historian of civilizations Braudel notes that civilization is marked by what it has rejected in the course of its life, rather than by what it has internalized, thus demarcating and clarifying its cultural and civilizational borders as a prerequisite for potential dialogue. Another dialogical error in my view, is the treatment of civilizations in a so-called diachronic or progressivist fashion. This implies that a civilized society signifies a higher stage of human development in contrast to the so-called barbaric or savage communities. This approach results in a hierarchy of civilizations, much similar to the current ordering of nation-states, military and exclusionary in its nature, and fraught with civilizational racism. A synchronic approach stands in contrast to the opposite, to the diachronic way. It assumes that all civilizations, even the most technologically advanced ones, contain elements of both culture and barbarity. And examples of civilized barbarism we could see plentiful in World War II atrocities, Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombing, San Bartholomew Night, and so on and so forth. Once we internalize that civilizations, even the most advanced civilizations, could have elements of both culture and barbarity, then we could grant all civilizations an equal standing in the world arena. Therefore, a philosophical shift from a solely diachronic way of treating civilizations to a combination between synchronic and diachronic methods is required. It could ensure plurality of cultural discourses without succumbing to the idea of a plurality of realities and truths, which could be a flip coin of the extreme case of applying synchronic approach. The second theme is whether the dialogue is possible at all. The potential for dialogue is dependent on the existence of the subjects of dialogue and on the strength of their foundational paradigms. Pondering the current state of Western and Russian civilizations, I argue that an effective dialogue between them will be quite difficult, if at all possible. Both parties have weakened cultural realms, and this is the main reason for that. Western civilization is civilization in decline and transit. Russia tries to defend its civilizational base, but still stands at cultural crossroads. British historian of civilizations Toynbee considered the civilizations in decline, and he argues that they exhibit three main features. First, they form universal states or empires that encompass the entire civilization, and these universal states are usually highly militarized and run by dominant minorities that detach themselves from the rest of society. Second, dying civilizations exhibit decline in their universal religions, and this outlines sets of taboos, timeless attitudes to life and death, work, pleasure, and family life. And third, declining civilizations experience migration from external proletariat to the civilizational core. Arguably, contemporary Western society exhibits all these marks of civilizational decline. First, it strives to create a universal state by uniting previous political nation-states units under the aegis of European Union and under the leadership of the United States, which is arguably faltering but still the strongest available. Second, it is experiencing a wave of migration from Middle East, Asia, and the new frontiers of its civilizational reach in Eastern Europe. Finally, and most importantly, Western political elites substitute Christianity and other Abrahamic foundations with religious, almost religious reverence of neoliberal ideology, left liberalism, and the so-called morality of aesthetic existence, to cite Michel Foucault. This new spiritual paradigm of the West is aimed at recasting the late modern fruits of Western civilization. The nation-state is challenged by multifarious networks of global governance and finance. The anthropocentric focus of modernity has shifted towards new fears of perceived overpopulation and of the consequences of technological automatization of economic life. Humans are now regarded as resources necessary for achieving desired ends. And previous humanistic ideals of equality that occupied the minds of liberals and socialists of 19th and 20th century have been significantly recast. It is unclear whether this new paradigm could form a new underlying structure for Western society. What is evident, however, is that the West is going through a period of decline of the old and the birth of a new civilizational doctrine. And Russia, what about Russia? Russian civilization also attempts to reformulate its basics, albeit without betraying its core foundations. As a sister stream of Western civilization, it proposes to remain within the bounds of Western modernity. At the same time, Russian civilization is struggling to recover from deadly wounds inflicted to it by the collapse of the USSR, an epitome of Russia's civilizational distinctness and an ideological substitute to Eastern Orthodoxy. Therefore, what we have here, we clearly lack well-shaped dialogical parties, as both Russian and Western civilizations are civilizations in transit. And while previous civilizational declines took place with relative ease, this process is currently shaped by the presence of nuclear capabilities. Therefore, political elites must account for the realities of this cultural transition and adopt adequate modes of a dialogue, which I briefly outlined in the beginning. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elena. So new paradigms are emerging. They might not necessarily reflect the core foundations of civilizations. That might be true more for the EU and Europe than it is perhaps for Russia, but it certainly changes the conditions in which dialogue and debate can take place. Thank you very much. Richard.
Thanks very much. I want to look at the intersection of orders and civilizations, and with a particular focus on the notion, and it's a question, it's a sort of an issue, the emergence of a post-Atlantic West. I'll explain that a bit more later, but basically the argument would be is that this new type of West is beginning to emerge. It's, you could call it a shift from a historic West. It's looking at its own roots and all the way back of Western civilization into antiquity. The actual immediate promptings of this notion of a post-Atlantic West has been mentioned. The potential defection of the United States from that Atlantic community as it's historically formed, in particular after 1945, but in some ways far longer than that. The re-emergence of the articulation of a far more substantive Gaullist Mitterrand tradition of pan-European continentalism. The Macron speech has been referred to before, the one to diplomats on the 27th of August, which, as I've argued, is possibly the single most important speech by a European leader in the last decade. It's stating a very clear position, and it's also anticipating resistance from what Macron, no less, calls the deep state. So it's, and immediately people have questioned it. In all of this, Brexit is an utterly sterile symptom of nothing more than a culmination of 40 years of British bad governance. Though it was a good example to Trump, and I agree completely that it shows it can be done, but I wonder what it is that Mick refers to. But also, this emergence of a post-Atlantic West provides an opportunity for a reappraisal of the West, not just of the historical West as in the post-1945 years, but its possible transformation in a cultural sense, a reflexive examination which goes back to its roots in Hellenic and even earlier civilization. So that's the big argument. More specifically, I would question the notion in that framework of a liberal international order. This term is a very strange term, which many of us had never even really particularly paid attention to or even understood 10, 15 years ago. What I'm arguing is that ultimately it's a conceptual confusion, and that instead of the liberal international order, I'd prefer to talk in terms of precisely an Atlantic power system. And this Atlantic power system has deep roots all the way back in the area of navigation, exploration, and ultimately colonialism and exploitation, and indeed development. And the modern manifestations of the Atlantic power system were, in modern manifestation, 1919, Wilsonian internationalism, then the adoption of the Atlantic Charter in August 1941 before the US joined the war, focusing very much on values and commitments of a common cultural community, which was hugely important, obviously, in the war. Then it was consolidated in the formation of NATO in 1949 and the EU in the 1950s. But this Atlantic power system is made up of three subsystems, each reinforcing each other in a constantly changing ways. It's not a single thing which stays and was born and has not evolved. But the three things are the power security system, in particular NATO, the economic system, in particular open markets, Bretton Woods after 1945, and thirdly, that normative political system of enormous value. This normative political value system is not an adjunct, but it's at the very heart of this Atlantic power system and its self-perception and legitimacy, and it's given it huge legitimacy across the world as well. But still, it is ultimately a power system. And this is why the Atlantic power system has always been accused of double standards and the European Union, particularly powerlessness, because of its embeddedness in an Atlantic power system in which the European Union has suffered from what I've argued elsewhere, involution. It simply could not evolve within that power system because in its security identity in particular, for example, obviously, and in certain other ways. And now we see this when the United States is beginning to defect from the Atlantic power system, of which it was actually at the modern heart. We see the powerlessness in response to the JCPOA, environmental, other world issues. After 1989, and this is an important point, this Atlantic power system radicalized in all sorts of ways. In the absence of a Soviet power system, which were held in check, and also acted as its conscience in many ways. So after 1989, we have this 25 years radicalization, 1989 to 2014, the Cold Peace. And it radicalized in four ways. I won't go into detail, but very briefly, just simply to say the Hobbesian way. It's power system, and obviously we've seen invasions, wars, and so on. And secondly, the Hayekian way, the globalization. Until 1989, we'd hardly use this word globalization. Look at indexes, and then it suddenly explodes as a project, an ideology, but also an opportunity, given the fact that there wasn't an alternative at that point. The third way it radicalized was the Kantian way, the democratic peace theory, trans-democracy, the endless democracy promotion language, and so on. And fourthly, and perhaps I'm not sure it's the right word, but let's call it Marcusean way. This is the politics of identity and other issues, what critics call cultural Marxism. But it is this sort of element. Yeah. As for Russia, I just want to say that in this framework, it is not, as per the national security strategy of the US in, I think it was December 2017, where both Russia and China were accused of being revisionist powers. They're not. They're deeply aligned, but they're not with India, etc., but they're not revisionist. The whole point is that this Atlantic power system after 1989 is what became revisionist with this fourfold radicalization. In fact, both Russia and China are deeply conservative status quo powers, challenged by this enormous dynamism after 1989, which led after 2014 to a second Cold War, and which we find ourselves in all sorts of cultural, economic, political manifestations. They're in favor of sovereign internationalism, of a conservative way. I don't have time to say how these then now interplay and interact in the various types of models of the international system today, which maybe a Q&A I'll go into that. But the key point is to suggest that this Atlantic power system and the moving beyond it is an opportunity. So it's taken in a strange sort of way, a crazy sort of man like Trump to say sensible things in challenging the existing the way that this Atlantic power system radicalized, how to spend the trillions for very little effect. So this is where I think that if we look at it in these terms, we can begin to see that this is, that out of this disorder, there are very, very strong parameters of a new order emerging, and we can begin to grasp the way it could take shape. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. So disorder is mostly a function of the crisis of the Atlantic West, the fact that it's radicalized a certain project that is also normative and that for the moment does not provide a basis on which to construct a proper order with countries that are not revisionist like Russia, but rather status quo conservative ones. Thank you very much. Christopher.
Thank you very much, Adrian. Is this on? Yes. Something very strange happened in the 1990s. Social scientists dropped the acronym DWEM, which stood for Dead White European Males, and adopted another one called WEIRD, Western Educated, Industrialized, Rich and Democratic. And the reason they did that was that the cognitive scientists and psychologists and economists realized that for 30 or 40 years, all the interviews and the poll data had been Westerners who'd been asked the questions. And they came to the extraordinary conclusion that Westerners, in fact, are not the human race, and that non-Western societies think differently from Western societies. That may not come as a remarkable revelation to you, but it came as a remarkable revelation to social scientists. In other words, they concluded that Westerners were the weirdest people in the world. The reason I bring this to your attention is that the European Union, or Europe, generally is facing another crisis that has barely been touched upon, and so the crisis of what I call European exceptionalism. That it is no longer possible for the Europeans to hold to this narrative, which goes back to the European Enlightenment. And the most important aspect of the European Enlightenment was the belief that Europe represented the future of the human race. I mentioned yesterday Martin Jakes, who describes the European Enlightenment as an example of European provincialism. This is changing. If you want an example of what I'm talking about, go back to 1798, when the West gets involved in the Middle East. Go back to the Napoleon's invasion of Egypt, a remarkable picture of Napoleon standing in front of the pyramids saying, "Gentlemen, we're introducing the Egyptians to civilization." By the way, incidentally, shortly after that, a French cannonball nicked off the tip of the Sphinx's nose, and the damage is still to be seen there today. Civilization was a term that the Europeans coined in the 1750s. It was a French term, and it meant European civilization. And that is no longer a belief that Europeans can hold to anymore. The third point I would make in all of this is that the West is in a bind when we come to even the concept of civilization. By the way, the European Union is not a civilization state and can never become a European civilizational state. It's a transnational community, and that makes it completely unique and different from anything that we've seen in history before. But why can't it become a civilizational state? Why can't it have all those 500 Confucius institutes? Why can't it have history syllabuses like the patriotic history syllabus courses that are mandatory in China, telling the Chinese students about the glories of Chinese civilization? Well, it can't for a number of reasons. It's embarrassed to even think of the concept of civilization. The attempt by American students, not their professors, to get Western civilization courses reinstated in American universities a few years ago has failed miserably. Western anthropologists no longer use the concept civilization because they think it's a false one. Just as in the 1960s they dropped the concept of tribe because they felt it carried certain imperialist overtones. Within Europe, if you want to see Europe as a civilization, as I do, you will find that there's a civil war going on. And it's represented very well by Michael Welbeck's novel Submission that came out in 2016. It's a civilizational row as to whether Europe is Christian, semi-Christian, non-Christian, secular, semi-Muslim, and it is already dividing East and West, the governments of Eastern Europe from the governments of Western Europe. And many West Europeans are coming to the conclusion they've long held that, in fact, East Europeans are uncivilized and essentially not even properly European, an idea that goes back to the European Enlightenment, in fact, and philosophers like Hegel. I want to make one other point before concluding, and that is that the Europeans were always able to congratulate themselves that they had a monopoly of ideas. Many years ago, Kishore Mahbubani wrote a book called Can Asians Think? And his conclusion was that they probably can think, but they didn't have the confidence or the self-confidence to do so. They continued to defer to European academics, professors, and intellectuals. In 2014, a book was written by an Iranian writer called Hamid Dabishi, Can Non-Europeans Think? And not only did he explain that non-Europeans can think, he actually listed a vast number of non-European thinkers who were coming up with some interesting ideas about a new global order, or a new set, perhaps even, of values. So that, too, has changed. The Europeans have lost the monopoly on knowledge, and certainly, I think, have forfeited the respect of many non-Europeans. But I want to finally conclude, because I know my time is up, by saying that this is no reason why the Europeans should abandon their values. They are facing another crisis. Those values are coming under challenge back at home, just as they did in the 1930s, by the way. There seems to be a cyclical challenge to the liberal ideas that I believe Europe embodies. So my argument is that, yes, the Europeans will have to tell themselves that they have values which are true, at least true for them. The principal reason for making that claim is the weight of their own history. We don't know how universal Western values are if only historians looking back in 50 or 100 years' time will be able to tell us that. We don't stand at the end of history able to look back. But I do think, we can't even prove, by the way, that there are such things as human rights. The historical record doesn't show that. It's a story that we have chosen to tell ourselves in the last 200 years. I think it's a pretty compelling story. But it's a very important story for Europe. And whether other people believe it or not is, to my mind, of very little consequence. The Europeans have to hammer it home, because they know from their own history the appalling consequences of assuming that human beings don't have rights. Thank you.
Christopher, thank you very much. So the crisis of European civilization is so deep because it is about essentially a question of self-belief. It's whether you believe your own stories. It's whether you have the confidence to defend those values and your identity in the world. And much of the origins of the current crisis, you say, actually originates in Europe rather than perhaps being, threatened by external powers. Thank you very much. Paul now for some thoughts, and then we have about 10 minutes of discussion among the panelists, and perhaps even time for one or two questions from the audience. We shall see. Paul, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Is this working?
Yeah.
I am deeply grateful for this opportunity. I am not an academic. I'm a consultant, a strategic consultant. My major client base is in Japan. I advise the Japanese government, certain ministries, and Japanese businesses, so I bring a certain different kind of point of view than most Americans would bring to the table. Having said that, I think that Professor Cox captured what I would consider a correct framework of understanding the United States. The U.S. today is a thriving democracy. We are not in decline. This notion of decline comes from the idea that the United States was a unipolar power, a hegemon, able to shape the world as we saw it fit. That's also a misnomer. It doesn't address the underlying principles of what the United States is really about. Secondly, the biggest challenge for the United States is to recognize that it is Russia that we must start a new dialogue with. This was articulated in an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal by the recently retired U.S. ambassador to Russia, John Huntsman. in which he basically admonishes Washington for its lack of understanding of Russia, and that we need a new dialogue. Basically, I'm not only in favor of a new dialogue, I want to frame it in a very different way than most would accept. Russia's fear of invasions shaped Russia's strategic thinking. 9 times, I believe, Russia has been invaded. The United States was slightly invaded by the British when you burnt down the White House in 1812, in the War of 1812. It was only once. And that was Admiral Colburn, by the way, who made that decision. Russia's fear of invasion also shaped Russian intelligence operations against the United States. There is no question that they interfered in the 2016 election. Now, I can go into the details any time, but that's not the point I'm trying to make here. The point is, metaphorically, it was an invasion of the United States. The way the United States thinks of itself as a sovereign democracy, and to have this kind of intelligence operation being launched against the U.S. freaked out our establishment. And we are overreacting. We come up with the point that President Trump is an asset of Moscow. This was a conclusion drawn by our intelligence agencies. Mistake. And that's why he's so angry and so bitter and lashing out, using his Twitter diplomacy, his Twittering, to lash out at people. Now, he's not the perfect president in terms of his behavior. He's from Queens, New York. I'm from Brooklyn. I really get the culture of Queens and Brooklyn, and there is a difference. He doesn't believe what he says. I do. The key to understanding the present crisis is to solve the U.S.-Russian dilemma for Europe. Europe is the battleground of the U.S. and Russia, from the Cold War to the post-Cold War, to the seizure of Crimea, to the Pyrrhic invasion of Ukraine. This again freaked out the United States. We saw this as a neo-colonial adventure. We look at China in the same way, that China is conducting neo-colonial policies in Africa and elsewhere through debt trap diplomacies. The official document of the National Security Strategy and National Defense Strategy is the wake-up call to our institutions. That's all it is. We had been so focused on the global war on terrorism. The entire CIA stopped doing intelligence work, monitoring potential adversaries. Careers were made by going into counter-terror operations in the CIA. We went into Iraq not only on a false premise, but in this neoconservative belief in our missionary zeal that we're going to make the world safe for democracy using U.S. military power to overthrow Arab dictatorships. We produced ISIS, came out of that process. We are in the middle of recognizing a strategic problem from Vietnam to Iraq. How many wars has the United States been in since Vietnam? How many have we won? This was Trump's campaign speeches. It resonated with the American people. They are pissed off at our establishment. Washington, New York, Hollywood. They hate these people. Identity politics? Give me a break. The Frankfurt School, Herbert Marcuse. I studied him in college. I was a student revolutionary in college. I read cultural Marxism from Gramsci all the way through. How you subvert Judeo-Christian culture. Through culture. That's the issue of civilization. So in addressing these kinds of things, I would like to have a more elaborate discussion on some of the underlying epistemological issues that really define how the United States was created. Myself, I'm a Platonist, rigorously so, although I studied German critical philosophy. from Kant, Hegel, Feuerbach, Marx. There was the Marxian dialectic. Marx was right about certain things. Even Pope John Paul said that in his 1982 encyclical. We need to have an intellectually honest dialogue of self-reflection, of understanding other cultures. The biggest weakness in the United States is other cultures don't exist. We don't think culturally. We think about power relationships. And now we're faced with a dilemma of a world potentially going into an uncontrollable collapse. Our financial institutions were deregulated from 1971 all the way up to the crash. Just track all the US legislation that deregulated the financial institutions. Marx called it finance capitalism. And he recognized the contradictions. He basically understood the British economy very well, not so much the American economy. We were very different. We were Hamiltonian, based on Jean-Baptiste Colbert and the use of centralized credit for development. The United States had two national banks set up by Hamilton's report on manufacturing and report on credit to Congress in 1790 and 1791. We used credit for infrastructure. We used tariffs to finance infrastructure in the 19th century. Then we adopted a little bit of the British model. Okay, I'm done.
Paul, I hate to cut people short, but we are really very, very short on time indeed. So we only have about 5 minutes left since there are other events following this panel. So I just wanted to raise one or two questions, and those who wish to get sort of in on the debate can do so. I mean, one question I think emerges from what's been said is, so even if cultures and civilizations have taken very different trajectories, you know, are there deeper social cultural ties? Are there certain values, even if we practice them in different ways, that still bind these different parts of Europe together? Say the Euro-Atlantic with the more sort of continental or Euro-Eurasian part of it. Or is it the case that Europe is never going to have, in the same way, a value system like civilizational states might do, or, say, liberal empires such as the US? So is Europe always going to be different, or are there still ways in which Europe can coalesce around certain values? Maybe the ambassador and then Mick.
Thank you.
Does it work? Yes, it does. Well, first, before addressing your question, I need to make a short comment in reply to what Mr. Goldstein said. Let me assure you, Russia did not interfere in the 2016 elections. The American political system, the American electoral system, medieval by definition, and that is accepted by US diplomats and other officials, is pretty capable of destroying itself without any help from outside. And actually, Russia never felt the need to interfere in US elections because the American political system is unable to produce a pro-Russian president to begin with, and we don't really care about everybody else who comes to the White House now or next time. Now, the question that was raised by our moderator, well, I believe that if we look down into history, we may find some precedents, some answers to the questions that we address today. For example, many people these days talk about hybrid wars. What was the first hybrid war? And what was the first tool of the hybrid war? I believe it was the Trojan horse.
So after all, very Greek.
And if we look further down, and well, not further down, of course, but closer to our times, yes, how did the United States come about? It was the result of violent separatism. Had it not been so, it would have remained part of the British Empire to this day. So you can look at historical events from different angles. Actually, it was the Russian Empire that, apart or along with France, of course, the role of France in the American Revolution and its first years is well known. But Russia was actually also siding. There were two naval flotillas sent from Russia to North America, one from the Atlantic side, one from the Pacific side, in order to provide support, if needed, in the struggle against the British Empire.
Absolutely. 1863.
Yeah. Indeed. Thank you.
Mick.
Well, you asked the question about are they defeatized. Let's go back to that original question. I ended in a rather pessimistic way because I do think there is a genuine challenge within the transatlantic architecture and in the transatlantic relationship, and I think you and I would agree on this, Richard. You outlined there were three factors that, in a sense, combined together to make it a very powerful vehicle for change, and one was NATO, the military, the economic, and the values. And in essence, much of that has not yet gone away, let's be perfectly honest. The continuity of NATO, President may have said it was obsolete, but those who actually operate NATO don't believe that for 1 second. On the economic ties, although there's a lot of talk about, much talk about the new Pacific economic relationship with the United States, actually still look at the fundamentals of the transatlantic economic relationship in terms of investments. You look at banking systems, London goes to sleep, New York wakes up. You look at the integration of those various companies. There's still an enormous amount of foreign direct investment, and some of the biggest brands, leading brands in the world, we could almost say are transatlantic, much in America. And then finally the values. So I don't want to overdo the pessimism on the transatlantic. It's just that I've been here before, as indeed I'm sure Christopher has, and I'm just wondering if this is not a rather critical, much more critical moment in that relationship than we had before. And I think the two reasons for that, or two or three reasons for that. One is it's Trump himself. I mean, however we explain his election, I don't want to get into that. The truth of the matter is, I mean, he's a wrecking ball. And, all the old structures he simply doesn't recognize, including the EU, which I think he actually seriously wants to break up, because I think he sees it as a fundamental economic competitor to the United States. His support for Brexit isn't just because he loves Boris Johnson, it is because he hates the European Union as an integrated social as well as an economic partner. So I think that's new. I think what is also new is the challenges facing Europe from within and without are pretty profound. And I want to come back just on the Brexit one. I've heard it said this morning, well, it's not that important. You know what the Brits are like. They've always been weird, sitting on that island off there with all that rotten weather and those horrible teeth that they had. Come on. I just think that this is a huge, huge crisis for the European Union. It is, after all, the UK is the 6th largest economy in the world. It's the 3rd largest or 2nd largest economy in Europe. It has military expenditure, it has its experience, and also it produces a kind of balance within Europe. I don't want to kind of go into balance of power, but everybody knows this in terms of the Franco-German relationship with the British league, and also the expertise that leads with it. So I kind of add those two things together. I don't want to make it too Anglo-American, but I do think that the double whammy of Brexit and Trump, and I think the two are connected, does present really, really big new challenges to the transatlantic architecture, even though I think many of those ties remain, as I think Richard alluded to, yeah.
Yeah, well, I think that's fascinating, not least for the reason that whilst there might be a realignment, in terms of Euro-Atlantic, Brexit more moving Britain in the direction of America with a, free trade deal that is on offer from the Trump administration on the one hand, but also with Russia not being integrated in the way that it tried to be in the 90s and early 2000s. And, A.J.P. Taylor said this, when Britain and Europe are not part of the wider security arrangements, Europe becomes a much less stable place. And so we're seeing really a kind of Euro-Atlantic realignment and a Eurasian one, with essentially middle Europe kind of stuck between those two sort of emerging poles, if I can use that word. Very briefly, very briefly, Yelena, Richard and Paul, but really it'll have to be 30 seconds each because we do have to wrap up, so I'm going to have to start being more of an enforcer now. Yelena.
To what Paul has to say about the dialogue, yes, I think the dialogue between the United States and Russia is needed, but I feel that the United States need more dialogue with Russia than Russia needs the United States, because instability, world instability, actually began with the demise of the Soviet Union, because USSR was that balancing, stabilizing factor of world politics, and the United States, interestingly, began to lose in its international legitimacy as a beacon of hope and the ground for morality and something for people to strive for with the demise of the Soviet Union. So that actually was the beginning of the end of your hegemony, and I mean intellectual, cultural, and political hegemony, not so much military and economic hegemony. And from that point of view, of course, the United States will need a dialogue with Russia as a stabilizing factor in world politics. That's my view. And another point I wanted to make, very brief one, is that the future of Europe, I think, will lie more with the alignment with the Eurasian unity community. Because if we look at the history of civilizations, how it's split, and if we treat Euro-Atlantic community as one civilization, and I've made an argument that this is a civilization in decline and transit, that every decline in civilization produces two offsprings. I wouldn't go very far deep into history, but for example, Hellenic civilization produced Byzantium and Latin West. So Syriac civilization produced Iranic and Arabic Islam, and so on. So historically, every civilization gives birth to two offspring. So transatlantic civilization, I believe the West, collective West, will give birth to two offsprings. That will be Europe, European Union, and United States. And usually those two offsprings compete with each other and quite dislike each other. For example, like Russia and the West, Byzantium, Latin West, and Eastern Christendom, and so on. So there will be some tension and competition, just judging by the very logic of history. And I will not be able to predict when it can happen, but maybe 100 years down the line. But that bifurcation is certainly in the making. So that's my intervention.
Richard.
In fact, it's very much building on that. My basic argument was perhaps a bit too dialectical, was to suggest that the Atlantic West has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And I would say that if Atlanticism is beginning, for the factors which we've mentioned, is beginning to be undermined, at the same time, it's this Atlantic West, we're actually then beginning to talk about a new West, if you like, moving away precisely of the routes which Helena has just mentioned. So this West, which includes Russia, which includes far bigger vision of the Middle East, a Mediterranean civilization, a pre-Atlantic West, if you see what I mean, which goes back 2.5, if not more, 1,000 years. So, and it's an opportunity, and obviously within that, this is why I don't buy into American declinism either, because this is part of, it's a hugely dynamic society, always innovation, always beginning to reinvent itself, just as Russia does as well. That's my point. So that, in other words, this West itself, and again, of course, it's reinventing the West, no longer as opposed to the East. So in a sense, you see, we're transcending the element. But this Atlantic West, you could, let me just even put it more provocatively, that the West was hijacked by Atlanticism some 500 years ago, and now it's finally being released from the toils of empire, from expansion, from exploitation, colonialism, and so on. And it's a chance for West to think about what it is and its real values. And that, of course, would mean an essential partnership between the two wings. It's not just the Atlantic, it was too small a measure to think about the dynamism of the West.
Paul.
Well, first, I respectfully disagree with the ambassador, but I think that's going to be part of our new dialogue. We need to understand that 400 years ago, China was the center of the universe. It was the biggest economy. It was global. Admiral He traveled around the world. They built a tributary state system, non-exploitive, so what? Somewhat, but it was. Now we're in a period where that 400-year cycle is coming back. And a cytocentric worldview is somewhat problematic from an American point of view. It's also problematic, I believe, from a Russian point of view, because I don't think Russia wants to be subordinate to the Chinese economic giant that it is today. And I think the point on the Eurasian Economic Union and the Eurasian Economic Bank is something for the West, specifically Japan, wants to explore, because Russia needs foreign direct investment. The size of your economy is the size of New York State. It's not very big. You have great military power, you're a nuclear power, you're an energy power, but you don't have a diversified economy. And the West, the United States in particular, and most importantly, Japan, is looking for the opportunity to help Russia. Now, U.S. policy right now makes the Japanese a little nervous. But the Japanese are building the Indo-Pacific region. It was Abe's concept to call it the Indo-Pacific. It was not an American concept. In 2007, he gave a speech during his first term. The second term, in 2012, he reiterated it. It influenced our thinking. The one foreign leader that has real influence on Trump is Abe. That's why Kim Jong-un decided to open up channels into Japan. We can go through that in great detail.
Thank you very much, Paul. For some concluding thoughts in 30 seconds, Christopher Coker.
I don't have a concluding thought. I just have a quip by Harpo Marx. I would prefer the West if it only were in the East. That might perhaps be the takeaway we should take away from this debate.
We could discuss the
Can I thank the audience for their incredible patience, and I apologize for not giving them an opportunity to ask questions, but please join me in thanking our speakers.